She stepped into the street just past dawn, barefoot and shivering, though the midsummer heat already pressed against the stones like a fevered hand. No one knew her name at first, only the shape of her madness. A woman in a red dress, hair unbound, limbs convulsing to a music only she could hear. Her arms flailed in time with a rhythm woven from silence, and her feet struck the cobblestones in a merciless, tireless staccato. She did not laugh, she did not scream, she only danced at first. The townspeople of Strasbourg watched in amusement, then unease, and then a fear too deep for words. For she did not stop not, as the sun climbed high, nor when the bell of vespers tolled across the rooftops, nor when night draped its velvet veil over the crooked lanes. She danced as though summoned by something older than the church, older than the bones buried beneath the cathedral's nave. On the second day, her body sagged with exhaustion, yet still she danced. On the third, her feet bled through the thin leather of her shoes, and by the fourth, she was no longer alone. They came in twos and threes at first. Another woman, her apron still damp from laundry, spun wildly in the square. A teenage boy, eyes glazed and lips trembling, joined without a word. A merchant dropped his satchel and collapsed into a twisting motion, arms flailing like a marionette, without strings. Something had caught them, not joy, not celebration, but a compulsion deeper than reason. By week's end, dozens thrashed through the streets. As if possessed by a single dark will, the cobblestones grew slick with blood. Knees cracked, ribs broke. Faces blurred beneath sweat and dust and dread. And still they danced. The council called upon physicians who spoke of overheated blood, of unbalanced humours stirred by the summer swelter. They prescribed cool baths, bloodletting, herbal tonics that did nothing but stain the lips of the dying. Others whispered that the saints were angry, that divine punishment had descended upon the town like smoke from a cursed candle. The church sent priests to chant prayers in Latin, to swing incense in trembling arcs, but the dancers only spun harder, as if the smoke fueled their frenzy. It was not possession, some said. It was surrender. As the weeks passed, the town began to change. The baker no longer rose before dawn. The bells rang at irregular hours. Mothers gripped their children tighter when passing the square. Doors slammed quickly. Windows stayed shuttered even in the heat. Those who did not dance became watchers silent, afraid, knowing their turn might come at any moment. And when it did, when a neighbour began to twitch, when a cousin began to sway, there was no stopping it. Only grief, only helplessness. The affliction passed like a secret song from body to body. One night, as the moon hung like a pale coin above the cathedral spire, a man collapsed mid-step. His chest rose once, then never again. They found his legs blackened from the knees down, muscle torn from tendon, bones splintered inside his skin, and still his face held the strange echo of a rhythm that had not yet stopped by the end of the month. Nearly 400 had danced. Some perished from heart attacks, others from exhaustion. Some were carried off, raving, their minds burned out like candles left too close to the flame. But many were buried with their arms still frozen, mid-motion, fingers curled in phantom music. No one knew why it began. No one could say when it might return. The council, desperate and bewildered, erected a stage outside the city walls and hired musicians to accompany the dancers, hoping structure might quell the storm. It did not. The music fed the fire. Viols and flutes only gave the terror a tempo. Still they danced under the watching stars, under the weeping eyes of their families, under the heavy gaze of a city brought to its knees by something it could not name. Some called it mass hysteria. Others named it ergot poisoning, or spiritual trauma, or repressed madness born of war and famine. But those who lived through it do not speak of explanations. They speak of the sound, the pounding of souls, the guttural gasps, the eerie synchronicity that made strangers move as one, bound by invisible threads. They speak of the eyes, blank and glistening, and they speak of the silence afterward, when the last dancer fell and no one dared to clap. Centuries have passed, and yet on some nights, when the wind curls low through the alleys and the city square lies empty, there are those who claim to hear its stiller, faint tapping, like rain on stone, or the soft echo of feet lost in time. They say the rhythm never left. It waits, buried beneath the city, like roots beneath cobblestones, like a breath held too long. Perhaps it was grief made manifest. Perhaps it was the body remembering pain too deep for words. Or perhaps it was something older, something that lives between breath and bone, that slips in through the cracks of civilization when no one is looking. A call to the wild, to the monstrous, to the forgotten part of ourselves that does not ask why. Only when and so the story remains not a tale of illness or miracle, but of surrender, a sacred madness, a dark communion in which the body, at last, dances free of the mind. There are corridors in history where the silence is louder than any voice, where the shadows grow longer with every century. In the heart of London, wrapped in stone and legend, the tower stands a fortress of iron will and ancient blood. Its walls remember everything. And within those walls, one summer long ago, 2 small lives disappeared like breath in winter. It was the year of 1483. England held its breath beneath a sky of betrayal. King Edward IV was dead, leaving behind 2 sons, Edward, Prince of Wales, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. The elder was 12, the younger 9. Boys with soft hands and proud brows, royal blood running fresh and untested through their veins. They were to be crowned, protected, cherished. Instead, they were hidden, brought to the Tower of London under the pretense of preparation for the coronation. The 2 brothers were placed under the care of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, man said to walk with a limp and a mind sharper than any blade. Days passed, then weeks. The coronation was delayed, then forgotten. Richard declared the boys illegitimate bastards born of sin, and soon after he claimed the throne for himself from the windows of the tower. The boys may have seen the spires of St. Paul's, the churning grey of the Thames, the ravens circling like black omens above. But then even those glimpses ceased. The boys were no longer seen in the garden. No more laughter echoed in the courtyard. No more scraps passed from their small hands to the palace dogs. The windows remained shuttered, and then nothing. No funeral, no bodies, no confessions. Only silence, and a crown resting heavier than ever upon Richard's brow. Rumours spread, like fire in dry grass. Some said the boys were smothered in their beds by moonlight. Others whispered of poison slipped into warm milk. A few believed they were spirited away, hidden by loyalists who waited for the right time to restore them. But the seasons turned, and their names faded from the lips of the living, and yet the tower did not forget. 2 centuries later, during the reign of Charles II, workers repairing a stairwell near the White Tower unearthed a wooden box, half-rotted and wedged deep beneath the stone. Inside were the bones of 2 children's, fragile, interwoven, as if clinging to one another in sleep. A nation wept anew. The bones were taken, examined, reburied in Westminster Abbey, but no truth was ever declared, no certainty ever spoken. Were they the princes, or just children of other tragedies, folded into a myth too vast to untangle? Richard III fell at Bosworth Field 2 years after taking the crown. His body was thrown naked over a horse, his skull cleaved, his spine twisted. The Tudors rose, and with them a new tale, one of a usurper who murdered his nephews for a throne that turned to ash in his grasp. Shakespeare would make him a monster, the hunchback king, the schemer, the child slayer, but history is never so clean. Some historians say Richard was innocent, that others had motived the Duke of Buckingham, perhaps, or Henry Tudor himself. Perhaps the boys died of illness. Perhaps they were kept alive, then quietly silenced when their existence became inconvenient. Perhaps the truth drowned in the same river that carried so many secrets out to sea. What remains is the absence, an absence that haunts the tower more completely than any ghost. Tourists wander through the stone halls and feel a chill when they reach the bloody tower. They lower their voices without meaning to. Children fall silent. Cameras fail. The air thickens. Some say the boys still walk there. 2 shadows, glimpsed hand in hand, 2 soft footsteps on ancient stairs. Whisper in the dark that sounds like a name long forgotten. Edward, Richard, and in the deepest hours of the night, when London sleeps and the ravens shift on their perches, the tower breathes out their story again, not in words, but in a hush, in a pause too long to be chance, the kind of silence that feels like it's watching you. In the end, it is not their lives that have endured, but their vanishing, not their crowns, but the dust where they should have stood. And perhaps that is the greater curse, not to be remembered as kings or martyrs or heroes, but to remain forever as questions, as echoes, as the cruelest kind of riddle, the one with no answer at all. The stones of the tower have seen blood and fire, queens weeping and traitors screaming. But of all its stories, none has settled so deeply into the bones of the place as that of 2 brothers who were once promised everything, and who left behind nothing but a silence that still bleeds through time. There are islands the sea remembers differently, where the salt tastes more of grief than tide, and the waves do not sing, but weep. Saipan is one of them. In the summer of 1944, its skies burned red for weeks. Bombs tore through its mountains. Firestorms licked its forests, and the air sowed thick once with the scent of breadfruit and mango turned to ash and blood. But it was not the roar of gunfire that left its deepest scar. It was the silence that came after, broken only by the cries of the falling dot at the edge of Sapan's cliffs, where jungle gives way to sky and sky gives way to sea. Thousands of civilians' mothers, grandfathers, children still wrapped in silk stood on the brink of a world they could no longer recognize. And then, like a wind-gathering sorrow, they leaped. It did not happen in a single moment, but like a slow unraveling of sanity and soul. The American forces had landed in June, carving their way inland through barbed wire and volcanic rock. By July, the defenders of Saipan had retreated north to caves and hills and the sacred final edge of the island, and with them came the civilians who had fled their homes, who had watched their fields burn, who had heard, again and again, that surrender was not survival but something worse. Whispers became laws. Propaganda became prophecy. Leaflets fluttered down from Tokyo like poisoned petals, warning of American cruelty. that women would be tortured, children butchered, honor destroyed, that the invaders were demons in human form. And in the heat and smoke of war, belief hardened into certainty. There, on the cliffs now called Bonsai Cliff and Marpy Point families, gathered not to pray, but to end. Some clutched photographs, others held dolls. Mothers tied children to their backs with strips of linen, whispering lullabies into the thunder of distant artillery. Some kissed the earth one last time. Others looked to the horizon as if waiting for the sun to forgive them. Then came the wind, and they began to fall, one by one. Then, in waves, the cliffs rang not with cries of terror, but with chants of Tenohaika, Bonza long live the emperor. Not as joy, but as resignation, as ritual, as mourning wrapped in duty. Eyewitnesses said it looked like a procession of ghost figures drifting forward, hair trailing behind them like smoke, then vanishing into the sea. Bodies struck the rocks. The tide turned red, and yet the line continued. American soldiers, horrified, tried to stop it. They shouted in broken Japanese, held out food, blankets, arms. Some wept as they watched. Others ran forward only to arrive too late, their boots slipping in blood. One soldier recalled a woman who paused, looked back at him, and then threw her infant into the waves before following. He remembered her eyes not fear, but finality, as if she were already halfway gone by the time the sun set. The sea was still again, but the water would never be clean. The cliffs remained black against the fading light, and in the crevices where small hands once clung, only silence remained. That night, the stars refused to blink. The jungle held its breath when the island was finally secured. The caves revealed more Horus families who had sealed themselves inside with grenades. Old men with ceremonial blades in their chests. Children poisoned by their own parents. The war had not just taken land or life, it had taken meaning. It had twisted honor into death, and still the cliffs watched. Decades passed. Stones crumbled, vines returned. Tourists came, and with them came questions, cameras, footsteps, but the cliffs did not answer. They never do. At dawn, the mist sometimes rises from the sea in strange shapes, like outstretched arms or drifting veils. Locals say the wind there speaks in lullabies, that if you stand too close, it pulls, not with force, but with sorrow, because grief remembers, because despair echoes, because something once sacred died. They're not just the people, but the trust between heaven and earth. No plaques can make sense of it. No monument can untangle it. It was not war, not really, not strategy, nor battle. It was belief turned into nightmare. The kind of belief that grows in the dark when the world narrows to rumors and ghosts. There are still families in Japan who light candles on certain days, not for victory or loss, but for those who vanished into silence. Their names are not always known, but the cliffs know them, the sea knows them, and perhaps that is enough. As the moon hangs over Saipan tonight, and the palms sway in winds that do not forget, the cliffs remain, still unchanged, waiting. And if you listen, not with ears, but with the soft place in your chest where sorrow lives, you might hear it, a final breath, a mother's song, a prayer, never answered. They marched into the trees like men entering a cathedral of moss and blood. The branches above them twisted like the ribs of some ancient creature, and the forest floor squelched beneath their boots as if alive and whispering. The Argonne swallowed them not with rage, but with silence, a sacred hush, as if the earth itself had opened its lungs and held its breath. It was October 1918. The war had dragged on for 4 bitter years, and the Musagon offensive was meant to be its final cry. Nearly 1 million American soldiers poured into the forests of northeastern France, mud clinging to their ankles, orders carved into trembling hands. The 77th Division advanced into the ravine near Charlevoix Mill, tasked with cutting off German supply lines. They were to move swiftly, like a blade through shadow. But the forest was older than war, older than reason, and it had no interest in maps or strategy. Major Charles Whittlesey led his men, nearly 600 of them, men to the thicket, mostly New Yorkers, bakers, dockhands, sons of immigrants who had never seen Europe until now. They were promised support from both flanks, promised clear skies above and strength at their backs. But promises rot quickly in the mud. The Germans closed around them like a vice. Communication lines fell. Artillery fire burst from both sides. Some American shells rained down as blindly as the enemies. They were surrounded, cut off, alone, and the forest began to change. Rain fell endlessly, soaking uniforms until skin blistered and peeled. Food ran out, water turned brown. At night, the woods whispered. Men began to mutter of shapes moving between the trees. A soldier awoke screaming, swearing he had seen his mother walking barefoot through the thorns. Another wept, holding the body of a comrade he called my brother, though no such man had served beside him. Bullets hissed through the trees, unseen. Every shadow became a threat. Every gust of wind felt like a breath. Some swore they heard, singing low and wet, like voices rising from beneath the ground. Whittlesey, gaunt and unshaved, scribbled his reports by candlelight, begging for aid, demanding ceasefires. Carrier pigeons became his lifeline. One by one, they fell from the sky, riddled with bullets or lost in smoke. All but one, a bird named Cher, a me wounded, blinded in one eye. Leg nearly severed, flew through hell and delivered a final message. But help did not come swiftly. By the time relief arrived, only 194 men remained, starved, hollow-eyed, half-mad. The rest were gone, swallowed by dirt, fire, or something no one could name. And yet, something had changed. The survivors spoke little of tactics or bravery. Their voices dropped when asked about those days in the woods. Some could no longer sleep. Others took to wandering forests, unable to remain in houses for long. A few refused to leave their bunkers ever again, and still the forest waits. To this day, the Argonne remains a cathedral of the lost. Tourists walk the trails, stepping over rusted helmets and bone-white shrapnel. The trees have grown thicker, older, but sometimes, if you walk alone, you may hear boots behind you, or whispers in a language half swallowed by the rain. There are stories, quiet ones, of hikers who vanish, of strange lights in the fog, of voices calling names that no longer exist. Because not all of the battalion came back. Some never died. Some never lived. Some simply remained, trapped in the breathless space between bullet and prayer. And the forest keeps their secrets well. No monument speaks their true fate. No history book bears the tremble of their footsteps. But they are, therein, the shifting leaves, in the hollow between trees, in the rain that tastes faintly of metal. Some say war is a moment, a clash, a victory or a failure. But sometimes war is a place, and the Argonne, it remembers. The hill was silent when they found them silent. In that way, the earth becomes only after it has swallowed something sacred or terrible. Clouds hung low over the city of Niterói, Brazil, casting a pale grey shroud over the scrubby rise, known to locals as Morro do Vintum. Children playing with kites had wandered too far up its slope and stumbled upon what looked, at first, like two men napping beneath the open sky. But there was something wrong in the stillness, something cold. They were laid side by side, dressed neatly in matching suits, raincoats drawn over their torsos like a pair of sleeping pilgrims. Beside them, the grass was flattened in a strange oval, like something heavy had once rested there. No blood, no wounds, no signs of violence or struggle, only silence. Their faces were covered not with cloth, but with something stranger, thin, hand-cut sheets of lead, molded roughly into masks and set gently over their eyes, as if to shield them from something too blinding to bear. Not a trace of fear lingered in their expressions. No grimace, no resistance, only a hush of peace, as if whatever had met them there had offered mercy or awe. The police arrived, then the press, then the questions that never left. Who were they? Their names were Manuel Pereira da Cruz and Miguel José Viana, electronics technicians from the inland town of Campos dos Goitacazes. Ordinary men by most accounts, quiet, thoughtful. They had left their homes on August 17, 1966, telling their families they needed to purchase materials for work. They boarded a bus. They bought waterproof coats. At one shop, they asked for a bottle of water mineral, sealed, and left in the direction of the hill. They carried with them a notebook. Inside, written in uneven, hurried script, were words that would become legend. 1630, be at the determined place. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect. Protect metals, await signal mask. Protect metals, await signal. Mask. Not a single pill was found in their bodies. No signs of poison. The water bottle lay untouched. The capsules, if taken, had vanished from the body like breath into the wind. And yet, the bodies had no wounds, no signs of panic. Only time had claimed them. The hill held its breath as investigators combed the area. The vegetation bent with secrets but offered no sound. Their watches were stopped at 4:30 p.m., exactly, perhaps by their own hand, or perhaps by something beyond time's grasp. As rumors swelled, deeper threads began to emerge. Manuel and Miguel were part of a small, secretive circle of spiritualists. Men who believed that the right combination of electricity, energy, and intention could open doorways to enlightenment or to something greater. They read of rays, of magnetic fields, of communicating with beings not bound by flesh. There were whispers of rituals, of previous experiments, of others who had attempted to contact celestial intelligence through circuits and silence. Some believed they had succeeded. Had they met something on that hill? Something they had prepared for with reverence and calculation? Did they expect a signal, a visitation, salvation? Or were they victims of faith too deep to return from? Theories poured in. A failed scientific experiment, a suicide pact cloaked in esoteric language, even an encounter with something from beyond the stars. But the lead mask screwed, silent, and heavy spoke louder than any report. Who makes such things? Why cover only the eyes? Were they shielding themselves from a blinding light not meant for human sight? Or were they trying to see something the rest of us cannot? Witnesses from the town described other oddities. A man seen near the base of the hill who vanished when approached, a flash in the sky that same evening. Dogs that would not climb the slope afterward. The children who found the bodies said they felt watched, though no one had followed them. Years passed, and the wind wore down the grass where they had lain. The case went cold. No arrests, no suspects, only the lead masks, now rusted with time, locked away in police archives, like relics of a forgotten rite. But the mystery never faded in the dreams of locals. Two men still walk the hill, silent faces covered, waiting for something that never arrived, or perhaps something that did something the rest of the world was never meant to see. On some nights, the fog rolls thick over Morro do Vintum, and the moonlight catches strangely on the earth, as if it reflects not off stone or leaf, but metal salt, dull metal shaped to fit the curve of a man's face. Some say they were fools. Others say they were prophets. But all who hear their story feel the same pause, the cold hush that follows an unanswered call, because what they sought, whatever it was, remains unknown. And somewhere, perhaps just above the clouds, a signal still echoes, waiting to be received. It began with a sound that did not belong to winter, not the creak of brittle branches, nor the scrape of sleighs on cobblestone, but a groan, a long, low, aching groan from the belly of something vast and full of secrets. Then came the cracking, sharp and sudden, like the breaking of bones inside the earth, and then it moved in the north end of Boston. On an otherwise unremarkable January afternoon in 1919, the city exhaled a breath it would never reclaim. A wave, dark and glistening, rushed forth from a towering steel tank. Not water, not fire, but molasses. 2 million gallons of it, black as sin and warm from fermentation, erupted with the force of a broken seal in the Book of Revelations. The tank, 50 feet tall and bound by rivets, too weary to hold, burst like a vein under pressure, and time slowed. A roar echoed through Commercial Street like thunder wrapped in honey. The wave stood 50 feet high and traveled faster than a man could run. A monstrous surge of syrup, heavy with death and shimmering with strange beauty in the pale winter sun. It was no ordinary flood. It moved with the weight of old promises, of sweetness long hoarded and now betrayed. It tore through the streets as if Boston were made of paper. Horses screamed before the tide pulled them under, their hooves thrashing, glazed in sugar before silence took them. Children on the docks vanished mid-laugh. Men were thrown through walls, buried where they stood, faces frozen in surprise as the warm darkness engulfed them. The force lifted a freight car and hurled it across the harbor like a toy in the hands of a bitter god. Trees splintered, cobblestones buckled, steel bent not from fire or war, but from molasses. And then it settled. Stillness fell, but not silence. Cries echoed from beneath the syrup. The air, once clean with the bite of frost, now carried a scent too sweet to be innocent. Sugar and rot, warmth and ruin. Survivors moved like ghosts through streets turned to treacle, boots sticking with every trembling step, clothes soaked. In the thick remains of neighbors and kin, the dead were hard to find. The syrup clung to them, pulled them inward. Limbs became shadows, faces vanished. Rescue workers used saws to cut through walls of molasses, digging by hand when shovels failed. One man was found days later, his body trapped beneath a wagon wheel, his mouth still open, as if to shout a warning too late. Some said it wasn't natural, that the tank had groaned for weeks, that workers had heard it moaning in the early morning hours, as if something inside wanted out. Others spoke of the fermenting liquid, expanding and bubbling in the cold, drunk on its own sweetness and waiting for the right moment to punish the city that caged it. The company blamed the temperature, the anarchists, the steel, but the steel had been thin, the tank had leaked. Children would press their hands to its side and collect the molasses that seeped out, like honey from a cracked hive. Everyone knew no one stopped it, and so it waited. It was not a quick flood, nor a clean one. The molasses oozed into basements, clung to stairwells, soaked into wood and lungs alike. The city spent weeks scraping it from sidewalks, pumping it from cellars, scrubbing it from skin. Horses were shot when they couldn't be pulled free. Rats drowned in sweet black silence. The streets steamed when the sun returned, releasing the scent again and again. That summer, when the wind was still, people said they could smell it. That warm, cloying sweetness rising from the bricks. It coated their sleep, slipped into their food. The molasses had made itself part of the city, and the city never truly rid itself of it. Years passed, children grew old, buildings were repaired, names were forgotten, but the scent remained. And then came the dreams. Survivors, those who had crawled through syrup, who had lost brothers, horses, names began to whisper of night visitations, dreams of drowning in thick black sweetness, of streets turning to tar underfoot, of loved ones reaching out from molasses-soaked walls. Some woke with the taste of sugar on their tongues, others with their arms frozen mid-swim. A baker swore that on warm days the dough in his hands would rise too fast, as if leavened by something ancient. A widow reported syrup dripping from her ceiling on the anniversary of the flood, though no pipes ran above her. She moved, but the scent followed by the 1930s. They called it the curse of the sweet death. Not aloud, never in courtrooms or papers, but in kitchens, in bars, in the quiet between neighbors who shared a glance. When the air turned warm and the scent returned, the city paved over the scars, built over them. But the ground remembers. On particularly hot days, some say you can still see a shimmer along the edges of the pavement where molasses once whispered its way into the veins of Boston. Tourists laugh, locals fall silent. There are those who say it was just an accident, that steel and sugar and steam conspired, and the city was simply in the wrong place. But there are others, quiet, older, who close their eyes and listen to the walls, because sometimes, in the dead of summer, when the city holds its breath, the molasses speaks again, and what it says is not sweet. The mountain was not meant to be named, even the Mansi, the native people of that cold, white silence in the northern Urals called it Kolat, Syakul, the mountain of the dead, not from myth, not from fear, from memory, from reverence, from things once seen and never again spoken of beneath the shroud of snow. And, in the winter of 1959, 9 souls dared to step across that threshold. They were young, mostly students, engineers, athletes, dreamers, hardened by Soviet frost and stirred by the promise of adventure. They carried with them maps, journals, sturdy boots, and laughter that echoed briefly in the frozen trees. They had climbed before. They were not naive. But the mountain does not care for credentials. It does not listen when you sing. The wind swallowed their voices. The sky grew heavy. And then ... Nothing. Days passed. Then weeks. And when searchers finally found them, the snow would not give up its secrets easily. First, there was the tent, still standing, partially collapsed, but slashed open from the inside, long, desperate gashes in the fabric, as though the occupants had clawed their way out rather than step through the flap. Their boots remained, tucked neatly near the entrance. Their coats hung untouched. The stove was unlit. The tracks in the snow told a story no one could read. Bare feet, socked feet, footsteps drifting from the camp and vanishing into whiteness. They found 2 bodies first frozen beside a pine tree, stripped to their underwear, skin tinted, strange orange mouths parted in a scream that never melted. Their hands were shredded, skin torn from fingers as if they had climbed the tree to escape something or someone. Or perhaps they were searching for something above that was never meant to be found. The third came next, curled in the snow as if still trying to reach the others. Then 6 more, scattered, hidden beneath layers of drift and silence. One had a fractured skull, another her chest crushed inward as though by pressure no man could apply, as though the air itself had turned to stone. Her tongue was gone, her eyes too. The skin around her was untouched. No blood in the snow, no tracks but their own, and above them the mountain remained mute. Watching Dot, the autopsy reports came back twisted in contradictions. No external wounds, no signs of struggle, but inside bones shattered, organs ruptured, radiation on their clothes, radiation as if the mountain itself pulsed with something unseen. Some said the injuries were like those from a car crash, but there were no cars, no roads, just snow and wind and a quiet that pressed against the soul like the weight of centuries. The official reports muttered something about an unknown compelling force. The phrase lingered. It still does. Theories bred like shadows. Avalanche, but there was no debris, no displaced snow, cold panic. Yet why flee barefoot into the blackness of night, into 30 below, with no fire, no hope? Some whispered of secret weapons, a military experiment gone wrong. Others spoke of orbs in the sky, glowing spheres witnessed by other hikers in the weeks before, lights that pulsed without heat, lights that hummed without origin. One journal found in the camp contained a single sentence, written in haste before the final entry: "We now know snowmen exist." It was dismissed, of course, a joke, a bit of absurdity from college students, but the laughter dies on the tongue when you stand in that place, when the trees loom to still, when the wind carries not just cold, but a listening as if something ancient is waiting for your breath to falter. The Mansi warned them. The mountain had taken before, hunters who walked too far, elders who dreamed too deeply, but warnings in winter are just wind to the eager. And so 9 walked in, and none returned. Families begged for truth. The state offered silence. Files were locked, resealed, altered. Witnesses disappeared. Investigators retired too early. And still the questions remain. Why did the snow not bury them for weeks? Why did the bodies show decay in the cold? Why did the hair on some turn grey overnight? Why did the ravens refuse to land? No animals touched them, and some nights, long after the last footprint has faded, hikers still claimed to hear voices near the pass, whispers carried on windless nights, lights that flicker in impossible patterns above the pines, footsteps in snow that lead nowhere, no birds, no fire, just a hum beneath the earth, low and endless. They renamed the pass after Dyatlov, the leader of the doomed expedition. A monument stands now, plain and cold, granite against granite, but the names etched into it do not tell the story. Names do not scream. Names do not run barefoot into the dark. The mountain remembers, and so do the trees, and sometimes, when the stars are close enough to touch, and the frost turns the world to glass, the wind returns, not with answers, but with echoes of laughter, of running feet, of silence, split like the tent's thin skin. And if you listen long enough, if you let your breath still and your heartbeat slow, you might hear it, that unknown compelling force, not as an explosion, but as a breath at the nape of your neck, waiting, watching, still unsatisfied. There are places where the land swallows sound, where the trees lean in with secrets curled in their rings, and the soil tastes of vanished names. Roanoke was such a place, long before maps knew the curves of the New World. Before any flag pierced the coastal winds, the island breathed in its own rhythm, salt air tangled with pine. Mist crawled across the marshes as if reluctant to lift. The forest stood ancient and waiting, and the water murmured in tongues no one had heard for centuries. There was no welcome, only silence thick, expectant, and watching. And into that hush, in the year of our Lord 1587, they came. Over 100 souls, carried across the teeth of the Atlantic. Dreamers, farmers, bricklayers, soldiers, women, with red cheeks and men with cracked palms. Children who had never seen a tree taller than a cottage roof. They came to make a home, to plant English roots in unfamiliar soil, to call something theirs. They built a wooden fort, staked down by hope and desperation. Rough dwellings lined with clay, roofs sealed with reeds. They carved out furrows in the ground, set traps in the woods, drew fresh water from creeks that whispered in the dark. And for a brief moment, the colony of Roanoke lived. But the land never softened. The winds bit harder here. The nights stretched longer. The forest edge felt too close. No matter how bright their fires burned, the darkness always pressed just a little closer. Governor John White, tasked with their survival, sailed back to England for more supplies, promising return in a season. But England burned in its own storms. War bloomed with Spain. Ships were seized, ports blockaded. 3 years passed. When White finally returned to Roanoke in 1590, the island met him with a wind that smelled of brine and ashand, a silence more complete than death. The fort still stood, the palisades unbroken, no blood on the walls, no scorch marks, no signs of siege or panic, no shallow graves or gnawed bones, just emptiness, as if a breath had been taken and never let out. The houses were dismantled, not destroyed, not burned, gently taken down, plank by plank, as though someone had hoped to carry the walls elsewhere. Tools were stacked. Food stores remained sealed. A child's shoe rested neatly by a door that no longer opened, and then, carved into the bark of a tree knot, hurried, not scratched in terror, but etched with care, was a single word, CROA2OA, no more. No plea for help, no map, no journal, no farewell. It was the name of a nearby island, and of a tribe. Croatoan White had told the settlers, if they left, and it was by choice, they should carve their destination. If it was under threat, they were to add a cross. There was no cross, but when he sailed to Croatoan, a storm rose like a curtain, wild and furious. His ship tossed in the waves, ropes screaming, sails torn. The sea did not want him to know, and he never returned, and so the story stilled. Whispers drifted across generations like smoke through trees. Some said the colonists were taken by the natives, by the Spanish, by spirits in the swamp. Others believed they walked willingly into the forest and never came back, pulled by something older than memory. Perhaps they became part of the Croatoan people, their blood lost in new rituals and languages, but the records of the tribes are quiet. Oral histories shift like sand, and no one claims them with certainty. No bones unearthed, no ruins traced. The islands simply exhaled, they were gone. Years passed. Centuries. Each time someone tried to understand, the forest seemed to press closer. Explorers reported strange figures watching from the shadows. Words in lost dialects whispered through the moss. A girl with pale eyes once claimed to see children in the trees, dressed in old linen, mouths open but soundless, and that name Crotonit lingered. It appeared in other vanishings, as though it followed the wind itself. Scribbled in the notebook of a dying sailor in 1812, found carved into the bedpost of Edgar Allan Poe the night before his unexplained death. Written on the walls of an abandoned hospital in New Orleans, decades before it burned. A name without anchor, a word with no master. Some say the settlers were claimed not by people, but by the land. That Roanoke sits on a fault in time, or soul, or something deeper, that once you step into its breath, you do not leave. You dissolve into bark, into loam, into wind. You become part of the hush. Others say they fled, driven mad by hunger and shadow, and vanished into the wild. No, different than leaves carried by a river too wide to cross. But those who walk the island now, who feel the mist crawl beneath their collar, who hear the silence settle like dust on their shoulders, they speak of something else, a presence, a waiting. Some say if you kneel where the fort once stood, and press your ear to the ground, you will hear it, not a scream, not a cry, but the soft sound of footsteps that should not be there, as though someone is still walking, still searching, still returning. There is no final word, no truth sharpened by time, only a tree, long rotted, once etched with a name. Only salt and fog, and the stories that live in the spaces where facts fade. Roanoke was not destroyed. It was not conquered. It was ... unwritten. The silence it left behind is not empty, it is full of weight, of breath held forever, of names that no longer need to be spoken. And maybe, just maybe, that's how they wanted it, to vanish not in horror, but into legend. To be remembered not as victims, but as echoes. And so the wind still circles that place, gentle, steady, patient, waiting for the next soul to ask what became of them. And listening, always listening, for the moment you realize some stories do not end. They simply go quiet. The hills of Buckinghamshire are quiet now, soft with moss and ash-coloured fog. But if you walk alone along the Thames on a night when the moon is pale and unwilling, you might find a path overgrown, veiled in nettles, that leads into the earth itself. Beneath chalk cliffs, past a yawning iron gate rusted shut by centuries, lies a hollow place carved not by nature, but by men who thought themselves gods. They called it the Hellfire Cave, not in jest, not in shame, but with reverence, in the 1700s, when the age of reason draped the world in powdered wigs and glittering lies, when parlours echoed with sermons on virtue while hands trembled under the table. A gathering of England's elite sought something older, something the churches had buried but the bones still remembered. They came at night, dukes, lords, poets, judges, the sons of empire, their names now dust in ledgers, their titles lost to ivy. But once they ruled over land, over life, and in the depths of that cave, beneath the polite hush of Georgian society, they stripped off their reason and clothed themselves in sin. Torches flared to life along damp stone corridors. Smoke curled across carved altars stained with old wine. or something darker? Echoes of laughter licked the ceiling, manic and echoing, as shadows danced on limestone walls that sweated like flesh. They called themselves the Order of the Friars of St. Francis of Wickham, but none knelt in prayer. Their chapel was a banquet, tables strewn with bones. Their hymns were moans beneath velvet masks. Their saints were Venus, Bacchus, and Pangods, who cared nothing for salvation. At the centre of it all stood Sir Francis Dashwood, the master of ceremonies, a statesman by day, cloaked in dignity, but here he wore crimson robes stitched with inverted crosses and gold thread that shimmered like snake scales. He welcomed his brethren with a smile too wide, his eyes glittering with secrets too deep. He called the cave a sanctuary from hypocrisy, a place where men could face their appetites, without fear of heaven or hell. But perhaps hell was listening. They began with theatre, costumes, revelry, ritual, satire cloaked in seduction. The walls rang with obscene parodies of mass, bread and wine replaced with flesh and fire. Women, some willing, others less so, were brought in, cloaked and crowned, lifted onto altars. Like offerings, they were called priestesses. They were called whores. They were never seen again. And the cave took it all in. Every chant, every laugh, every drop spilled in ecstasy or cruelty. Over time, the line between jest and devotion blurred. They summoned demons not as play, but as prayer. They drew circles in ash and bone. They whispered to old gods with names not written. Some claimed the cave groaned during their rites, that the stone itself seemed to breathe. Then madness bloomed. One by one, the friars began to unravel. A marquis was found wandering the hills, naked and bleeding, his mouth sewn shut by his own hand. A judge slit his throat at the bench mid-trial, whispering, "She's watching from the fire." A poet buried himself alive in his garden, leaving behind only the words, "I heard her name spoken in the dark." Sir Francis himself grew pale and hollow-eyed, though no one dared speak it. He claimed visions of wings behind the candlelight, of figures in the smoke. He said he was chosen, that he had seen through the veil, that something beautiful waited on the other side of pain. But the cave grew colder. The torches began to flicker without wind. And in the year of the great storm, when thunder cracked open the countryside, a final ritual was held. No record tells what they did that night, only that when dawn broke, the cave's entrance was sealed. The friars were never seen again. Some say the hill collapsed, swallowing them whole. Others believe the order fled to France or Rome or deeper places still. But the townsfolk whispered another truth, that the earth itself closed its mouth, not to protect us from them, but to protect us from what answered. For years the cave lay silent, a wound hidden by ivy and time. But time is a thin veil. In the 20th century, the entrance was uncovered. Tourists began to walk its halls, laughing nervously at the carvings of robed figures and pentagrams, at the graffiti etched by candlelight. They took photos, touched the altar, mocked the legends, but some did not return the same. A girl vanished near the inner temple. A man was found in his car just beyond the cave mouth, eyes wide open, heart burst from within. And every so often, on the edge of hearing, visitors report voices whispering in Latin or something older despite being alone. The air in the lowest chamber remains heavy, thick like breath held too long. The torches there will not stay lit. The floor is warm, even in winter. Some say hell still breathes there, not fire, not brimstone, but longing. Hunger as if the cave itself remembers pleasure so extreme it bled into agony. Worship so dark it echoed back from the abyss. And now, it waits. The men who built their temple beneath the chalk believed they were free. That sin was power. That laughter was stronger than damnation. But in the end, even their voices were devoured by the dark dot. So if you ever stand at the mouth of the hellfire cave, if the wind rises and the torch wavers in your hand, listen closely. The stone may still echo with their laughter, or something far worse. The Neva River does not sleep. Beneath its frozen skin, something stirs. On winter nights when the wind howls low like a beast in mourning and frost clings to every window pane like a forgotten prayer, there are those in Petersburg who say they still feel his eyes watching, waiting. Eyes that once saw the children dance, that burned through velvet and incense, through bullets and betrayal. Eyes that would not close, even in death. Grigory Yefimovich, Rasputin. To the world, he was many things: a mystic, a drunk, a prophet, a devil, a peasant in tattered robes who wandered from Siberian dirt to imperial opulence on nothing but rumor and rage. But to Russia, he was something else, entirely something that lived in the gap between faith and fear, between miracle and madness. He arrived in Petersburg like a shadow out of time, filthy, tall, smelling of sweat, soil, and something. Old, his beard matted like a prophet's, his voice thick as storm water. They laughed, at first. A peasant healer with sunburnt hands and wolfish eyes. What threat could he be? But he touched the boy. The hemophiliac heir, Alexapel, fragile, trembling. From within, no doctor could stop the bleeding. No prayer could hush his cries. Then came Rasputin, muttering chants beneath his breath, laying his hand upon the child's brow. The bleeding ceased. The child slept. The Empress wept. From that night, he belonged to her, or she to him. He moved through the palace like smoke, uninvited, but never turned away, whispering into Alexandra's ear, standing too close in dark corridors, eyes glittering behind candlelight. Ministers were dismissed at his word. Laws bent, enemies vanished. They called him the mad monk, but he wore no habit, swore no vows. He drank, debauched, and danced with whores beneath icons of saints. Yet still, when the boy bled, it was Rasputin they summoned, and always the bleeding stopped. Power grew around him like fungus on damp stone. He spoke of visions, of divine fire, of angels with burning wings, and cities collapsing in flame. Some nights, his shrieks echoed down palace halls as he fell into ecstasy or tormented. Was hard to say which, but the Empress believed. She said he was sent by God. The court believed otherwise. They said he was poisoning the empire, that the Romanovs were under a spell, that the monk had his fingers wrapped around the throat of Russia and would not let go. So they conspired. It was Prince Felix Yusupov who led them, a man of silk and cruelty, desperate to purge the rot in the empire's heart. He invited Rasputin to his palace under pretense of wine, music, and sin, a final indulgence. The snow fell heavy that night. The moon swam in fog, and Rasputin came and washed, uninvited, exactly as he always had. They fed him cakes laced with cyanide, thick slices soaked in poisoned wine. But he only laughed, his teeth yellow, his voice like gravel dragged over bone. He drank more, ate more, his eyes gleamed. They began to panic. Why, Yusupov fetched a revolver. The first shot struck him in the chest. Loud, silent, they breathed, began to speak in low voices of disposal, of ice and rope and secrecy. Then Rasputin stirred. He rose, blood pouring from his side, mouth cracked open in a groan not quite human. He lunged, struck Yusupov to the floor, clawing toward the door with ragged breath, trailing blood like ink. Another gun. More shots, into his back, his head. Still he crawled. It took them hours to kill him. Finally, they bound his body in chains, dragged it across the frozen courtyard, and cast him into the icy Neva. The waters swallowed him in silence. When he was found days later, the body told its own story. The lungs were full of water. He had drowned, not died from poison or bullet or blade. His wrists were torn, bound too tight. His hands were raised clawed, frozen, reaching dot as if even in death he had tried to rise. They buried him in secret, then burned what remained. Ashes, scattered across the wind, his name forbidden, his memory feared. But Russia did not forget. The Tsar fell. The empire crumbled. The children he had once blessed were shot in a cellar. And those who had murdered him, one by one, they too were lost madness, exile, execution, as though Rasputin had cursed them with his final breath, and in some deep place, perhaps he had. They say his eyes never closed, that when they found him beneath the river, his gaze was fixed open, wild and unyielding, as if he had seen something. Not death, not pain, but truth. What truth, no one could say. Only that something ancient had passed through him, something raw and holy and terrible, a conduit, a crack in the veil. He was not good, he was not evil, he was simply open and through. Him, the old world screamed its final song. So now, when Petersburg freezes and the river groans beneath its ice, some still whisper his name, not in prayer, not in fear, but in awe. For Rasputin was not a man who lived. He was a silence that could not be killed. There are nights when the earth itself seems to dream, but it is no gentle dreaming, no slow, quiet slumber. It is a nightmare made of stone and flame, a dream that shudders up from the blackest depths and tears the surface world into ruin. So it was in the winter of 1855, when the city called Ido learned what it meant to sleep on the spine of a restless god. It began with a hush, a stillness so deep the lanterns seemed to hold their breath, a night of brittle cold and paper walls straining in silence. The fishermen along the Sumida River spoke of strange ripples in the water, as though something vast and unseen was shifting far below, but no one listened. The city was too busy with its own hunger's markets, bright with rice and silk, alleys red with lantern light, temples murmuring incense into the sky. Then, just as the hour of the dog yielded to the hour of the boar, the world's convulsed, no warning cry, no prelude, only the instant and absolute violence of a quake that split the streets like rotted cloth. The ground swelled underfoot, rolling as if some giant hand pressed it from beneath. Roofs cracked, clay tiles cascading like rain, walls burst outward in plumes of dust and shrieks. The river heaved itself over its banks, swallowing men whole, and in the darkness, a roarlow unearthly, the sound of the planet remembering its own hunger. They would call it the Ansei-Edo earthquake. But in that hour, no name mattered. The city burned. Fire broke loose, as though it had been waiting in secret for centuries. Paper homes, lacquered shrines, the countless wooden bridges arching over canals, they became torches, Entire districts dissolved in sheets of flame. Ash fell so thick it blurred the moon, and in the glow, survivors staggered through the wreckage, their faces lit like masks in a fever dream. When dawn finally crept over the ruin, Edo lay gutted, more than 7,000 dead, thousands more injured, homeless, dazed among smoking beams. The air stank of scorched cedar and sorrow. Yet amid that grief, something strange began to bloom. Images, woodblock prints, pressed and sold by the hundreds, depicting not just the fire and fallen temples, but something deeper, older, a vision of disaster as a living thing in these prints. A monstrous catfish sprawled beneath the city Namazu, the earthquake fish, his body coiled around the islands of Japan, his whiskers stirring the ocean's wrath. It was said Namazu slept, pinned beneath a stone by the god Kashima, who alone could hold him still. But sometimes when faith faltered or arrogance grew, Kashima's grip slipped. The fish awoke, and the earth shivered in fear. These images were not mere stories. They were confessions, admissions that no wall, no law, no emperor's decree could command the trembling dark beneath their feet. One print showed Namazu writhing as Kashima's foot slipped from the sacred stone. Another painted a legion of tiny demons, grinning as they pried open fissures in the earth. Others showed priests bowing low, offering rice and coins to appease the beast's hunger. The people bought them in droves, hung them in doorways and shrines. Some believed the prints themselves could quiet the catfish's rage, like a paper talisman against annihilation. But the images were also satire whispers that the great fish's lashing tail was not only nature's cruelty but a judgment, that the powerful had grown corrupt, that greed had piled too high, that Edo's wealth was a provocation the earth could no longer endure. 1,000 tiny rebellions etched in ink, the fish crushing rich merchants beneath its belly, sparing the humble farmers, delivering justice no human law dared in the ruins. This idea took hold, that disaster was not blind, that it chose, and so fear found a shape scaled, whiskered, smiling in cruel wisdom. As the weeks passed, the fires died to embers, the wounded were buried or led away. Charcoal bones of the city stood against the cold, hollow as old teeth. Yet the prints kept coming. Namazu in every form, triumphant, mournful, glutted on sorrow. The presses worked day and night, the woodblocks inked in black and vermilion. Even as carpenters hammered new beams into place, survivors could not look away from the monster that had undone them. Some say the prints were more infectious than the quake itself, that they seeded a deeper, quieter fracture, one that split the city's certainty that the world was knowable. If the earth could rebel, if the gods themselves could slip, then nothing was safe, nothing was permanent. Years passed. Edo rebuilt nails, driven into new timber, canals cleared of debris. But in the alleys where old ash lingered, where fire had kissed the stones black, the nightmare never fully departed. Even now, in the temples, you can find worn amulets bearing Namazu's form, a reminder that he still dreams, that one night he may thrash again. The prints survive, fragile as dried leaves. Each stroke of the carving knife carries the echo of that winter, a testament to the moment the city looked into the abyss and found it smiling back, and in the hush before dawn, when the river laps gently at the pilings and the earth seems to still, some claim to hear the rumble far below Namazu stirring once more. For the world does not forget the touch of nightmare. It waits, patient, under centuries of stone and denial, and every so often it remembers. There are places so cold the soul forgets how to breathe, where silence is not absence, but presence, a living thing that wraps itself around wood, cloth, and bone. And there, in the brittle desolation of the polar night, a ship may vanish not by wind or wave, but by the slow, patient hunger of the unknown. They called it the Franklin expedition, a journey etched in ambition and brass. In 1845, two ships, MS Erebus and HMS Terrace, sailed from England, gleaming with imperial hope, their hulls black and armoured with iron to brave the crushing ice. They were to chart the last elusive stretch of the Northwest Passage, that mythical artery between oceans, whispered about since the days of empires born on maps. On their decks stood 129 officers, sailors, surgeons, even a dog-face is scrubbed, uniforms stiff with ceremony, spirits high with the pride of progress. They sailed from Greenhithe into legend, past the Orkneys, past Greenland, and into a corridor of ice, where the sun bleeds low across the horizon like a dying lamp, and then nothing. The Erebus and Terror vanished. For years they were swallowed by the North's white throat. Not a signal, not a whisper. The ice held its secrets. Search parties combed the archipelago in vain, mapping nothing but sorrow. The fate of Franklin became a national obsession, ghost story whispered across drawing rooms, prayed over in cathedral pews. Where had the ships gone? What storm or madness had taken them? It would take more than a decade for the first hints to drift south like scraps of old sails. On King William Island, Inuit elders spoke of men who walked with blackened lips and eyes like glass, who marched in single file across the white wastes, dragging sledges heavy with books and silver and despair. They told of a ship crushed by the ice, and another trapped and silent, its smokestack rising like a tombstone from the snow. From these tales, relics emerged, forks etched with initials, boots lined with rabbit fur, torn pages of journals frozen. In mid-thought, and bodies, bodies, bodies. Some lay twisted in shallow graves on Beachy Island, their faces gaunt but eerily untouched by decay. One had eyes still wide, mouth open as if gasping at the last breath he never drew. Another was dressed in full naval regalia, coat buttoned, hair combed, as though death had asked politely to enter. But worse were the signs that followed: human bones cracked open, slices in sinew, clean and deliberate, flesh removed, the teeth, marks of desperation, cannibalism. It was a word the Admiralty dared not speak, but it floated there, just under the surface, like the ships themselves, drifting beneath the ice, preserved in cold reverence in the ship's remains, found finally, over a century later, by modern explorers. Nothing moved. The decks were mute, tables still set, a single teacup overturned beside a map of the Victoria Strait, and beneath the decks, sealed in shadow and frost, they found sealed tins of food poisoned by lead, charts scrawled with frantic corrections, and boots left by the door, waiting for feet that would never return. What happened in those final days, when the white sun never rose and the men were trapped in a world that offered no mercy? Some say the ice broke their minds before it broke their bones, that the sunless months birthed hallucinations, that they saw things in the snow faces, whispers, shadows that called them by name, that the North itself, old and without pity, drew the warmth from their hearts until they became not men, but echoes. There were reports of a final march, dozens of survivors fleeing the ships in a last pitiful exodus, sledges heavy with silverware, sacred books, and lifeless comrades. One journal entry scratched in the corner of a weather-stained page reads simply, "We are going south." But there was no south, only more cold, only more white. Some bodies were found curled together in the snow, arms wrapped as though bracing against a blizzard that had long since passed. Others sat propped against stones, hands folded, as if awaiting a command that never came. One had removed his boots, toes bare to the wind, frostbitten and black. Another still held a spoon, frozen mid-bite. When the wrecks were finally found, terror resting upright as those still crude. And Erebus, deeper, like a drowned cathedral, there was no sound. Just the cold, endless dark, and the creak of wooden bones remembering. They say time itself slows in the Arctic, that the wind carries whispers in languages no longer spoken, that somewhere beneath the snow the last heartbeat of the Erebus still thrums a slow, haunted drumbeat, calling the dead to order. And what of Franklin? His grave was never truly found. Some believe he died early, buried in the first frost. Others claim he walked among the last, his breath shallow, his coat flapping like a flag of surrender. Or perhaps he became part of the ice itself, his story, folded into the sheets of white that roll eternally across the tundra, in the quiet moments between aurora and midnight, when even the stars seem too distant to comfort. The tale of the phantom ships returns. 2 vessels, crewed by ghosts, forever drifting beneath the ice. Sails tattered, lanterns dim, eyes wide. They are not lost, they are waiting, and the Arctic remembers. It began with a sound no one in Tottenham Court Road could name, a deep, groaning shudder from beneath the earth, as though some vast beast had stirred from sleep. The air trembled. Then came the sound of splitting iron, like chains tearing through time itself, followed by the roar, not of fire, not of thunder, but of something thicker, darker, and impossibly alive. It came not from the heavens, but from below, at the Moe Brewery, where brick walls held vats tall as houses and thick as towers. One of them a colossus of pitch-black, iron-ruptured, like an overripe fruit. A vat meant to hold over 300,000 gallons of porter, ale dark as the Thames at midnight, brewed for the poor, stored for profit, sacred to the city's thirst. The vat did not rupture alone. As it burst, it cracked the girders of its brethren, and within moments other vats joined in the collapsed dominoes of iron and foam. And then the wave, a flood of beer, 10 feet high and rolling fast as a firestorm, smashed through the confines of the brewery, erupting into the narrow slums. Behind it, porter raged like a river unloosed from hell, hurling timber and brick, lifting wagons from the cobblestones, tearing loose fences, striking down lamps and chimney stacks. It came too fast for breath. Cellar walls collapsed under the weight. Wooden beams groaned and gave. In the basements of George Street and New Street, families gathered in prayer were ripped from one another's arms. Infants drowned in their cradles. Mothers clung to ceilings as barrels bobbed below like corpses. And outside, those who had only moments before been warming bread or mending shoes were hurled against stone walls, their screams swallowed by froth and foam. In the Horseshoe Brewery there were no alarms, no time for warning, only the deafening surge, and then silence. When the waters finally sank into the earth, soaked into cobblestones, seeped into soil, pooled in the boots of the dead, the city was left not with rubble, but with a stench. Sweet, bitter, unholy, the smell of malt and iron, of yeast and flesh. They found 8 bodies, at least, that is what the records say. Some were pulled from beneath beams, others from cellars where they'd floated like broken puppets. One girl had been sitting on her father's lap. Another, a washerwoman, had tried to scramble onto her roof before the porter swept her away. A boy was found in his nightshirt, arms outstretched as if still dreaming. But the death toll was never truly counted. Many of the dead were never registered. In a city where the poor had no names on marble, only chalk on doors and soot on skin, the wave took those no one looked for. And among them, whispers began to rise of shadows in alleyways where no one walked, of beer stains that would not fade, of cries heard in the dark beneath floorboards. At the inquest, the brewery owners insisted it was an act of God, that the iron bands had given without warning, that there was no fault, only fate. The jurors agreed. No one was punished. No reparations were made. The flood was ruled a visitation. But what God sends beer to kill the poor? Even the magistrates paused at that, and still the scent lingered. For weeks the alleys reeked of roasted malt and soaked grain. Bread turned bitter. Rats emerged, bloated and dazed. The cobblestones grew slick with a dark sheen that even lie could not erase. Some claimed that after sunset, the air changed, grew heavy with damp sweetness, that people walking through St. Giles at dusk would feel suddenly drunk, vision blurring, knees weak, though they'd touched no drink in hours. Children began to dream of drowning not in water, but in dark foam, their lungs clogged with song and smoke. Mothers lit candles near the drains. The devout spoke of cleansing prayers and marked doorways with salt. Years passed, and the flood was folded into rumor. But the stains remained. In cellars where beer had flowed deepest, mold never took hold, but neither did peace. One family, who moved into a home above the worst of it, reported a dampness that rose through the floorboards, curling the edges of books and warping the faces in their framed portraits. Their youngest daughter began waking in the middle of the night, gasping, swearing that someone had whispered her name from beneath the floor. She said the voice smelled like bread. They moved out within a month. The Moe Brewery was eventually rebuilt, and the city forgot, as London does. New bricks covered old, new prayers buried old curses. But the ground never dried completely, and some nights quiet, unhurried nights, when the wind comes low and eastward, there's a scent in the dark that turns the stomach, and stirs memory of something sweet, of something ruined. And for those who know where to look, behind the newer buildings, etched faintly in stone, there is still the line where the beer rose high as a man's shoulders, still marked after all these years, and beside it a darker smear. They say it was blood. They say if you press your hand to it, the stone is warm. In the quiet alleys of old St. Giles, the past is not buried. It breathes beneath the cobblestones, beneath the cellars, beneath the laughter of drunks and the rattle of carts. And if you stand very still and listen not with your ears, but with your skin, you can hear it. The hum of barrels swelling, the groan of iron, the roar. Just before the silence, beneath the scorched breath of the Uzbek sun, beyond the cracked silence of Samarkand's dust-heavy roads, there lies a tomb swathed in shadows and superstition. It is not hidden. In fact, it towers majestic, sapphire-domed, flanked by calligraphy that shimmers like starlight on obsidian. Guriamir, they call it, the tomb of the king. But the locals whisper a different name in the stillness of dusk. The mouth of the curse inside sleeps, a conqueror born limping, Timur, the lame, the scourge of Asia, a man whose armies drowned kingdoms in fire, who built towers of skulls to mark his passage, who declared himself the sword of destiny. He was the kind of man history fears more than it honors. A butcher cloaked in silk, a visionary made of iron. And when he died in the winter of 1405, the earth did not sigh in relief, it held its breath. His body was laid beneath black jade, veined like dried rivers, beneath verses of Quranic warning and Persian pride. And on that tomb, etched in deep curling script, were words not of praise but of warning. Whosoever disturbs my grave shall unleash an invader more terrible than I. For 5 centuries, no hand dared lift the lid. The grave remained closed while empires rose and fell around it, as silk roots shifted and modernity began to claw its way into the bones of the East. Samarkand aged like a forgotten relic, dreaming in silence. But silence does not last forever. In June of 1941, under Stalin's decree, a Soviet expedition arrived with shovels and cameras, notebooks and skepticism. They came not as believers, but as men of the state, tasked with uncovering the remains of a warlord to feed the hungry stomach of propaganda. Timur, they thought, would serve as another victory and other jewel in the red crown of historical conquest. The locals begged them not to do it. Old men with hands like parchment crossed themselves with trembling fingers. Women offered bread and salt, weeping. A mullah tried to bar the gate, warning that Timur's sleep was sacred and sealed with blood. But the Soviets laughed. They mocked the trembling and spoke of bones as if they were stones. The tomb was opened on June 19, 1941. The air inside was heavy, not just with time, but with something else, something ancient and mournful, a scent of dried roses and smoke, of earth packed with memory. Candles flickered without flame. The sarcophagus stood untouched in the gloom, black as a moonless sea. They opened it. Inside lay Timur. His body, mummified by time, bore the unmistakable signs of the legend. His right leg shorter than his left, his chest broad, warrior-formed, his hands curled as if still holding the reins of empire. Scientists scribbled their findings, photos were taken, bones were catalogued, and 2 days later, the sky in Moscow turned to ash. On June 22nd, Adolf Hitler, with the might of 3 million soldiers, launched Operation Barb, a massive, brutal invasion of the Soviet Union, the greatest land assault in human history. Blitzkrieg thundered across the steppe, and entire cities were set aflame before sunrise. Coincidence, the scholars insisted, mere timing. The winds of war had long been blowing. But in Samarkand, the elders closed their shutters and whispered prayers. As bombs fell on Minsk and Leningrad cried out in fire, fear took root in the heart of the expedition. Reports of the curse reached Moscow. The cryptic warning, once dismissed, now echoed in dark corridors and sleepless bunkers. Stalin iron-hearted. Godless, Stalin grew silent. By November of 1942, the Red Army was broken, bleeding, and cornered at Stalingrad. Death was a tide with no moon. It was then, only then, that the order came from the Kremlin. Return Timur to his grave. The journey was quiet, reverent, a strange reversal. Where once they had marched with pride, now they moved with caution, as though carrying a storm. They covered the bones in velvet. A Koran was placed beside him. Prayers were spoken, not by priests, but by generals with shaking voices. On December 20th, 1942, they sealed the tomb once more. 3 days later, On the frozen banks of the Volga, the tide of war turned. The German Sixth Army began to crumble. Snow fell like a blessing. Soviet forces surrounded the invaders with ruthless precision. What had seemed like the final hour became the first breath of survival. Historians will tell you it was strategy, supply lines, the bitter cold. But the people of Samarkand know better. They say Timur's soul had risen, furious, to remind the world of his wrath, that his slumber must never again be broken. And when he was returned to the earth, the spirits of the steppe stood down. They say it was not steel that saved Russia but silence, restored. Even now, decades later, no one dares open the tomb again. Visitors approach it like pilgrims. Some speak softly to the stone, asking forgiveness on behalf of the past. Others leave offerings, coins, flowers, scraps of cloth tied to nearby trees, like old prayers caught in the wind. And the inscription remains, cold and clear. Whosoever disturbs my grave shall unleash an invader more terrible than I. There are those who scoff, who say the timing was luck, the rest folklore, that bones do not command armies, and tombs do not call down war. But in the hush between midnight and dawn, when the desert wind passes over Samarkand, and the stars seem older than belief, something stirs in the silence. Not quite a voice, not quite an echo, but a knowing, as if the earth itself remembers, as if it waits, as if beneath the black jade lid, a conqueror still listens. Moonlight fell like spilled mercury over the Bavarian Alps, casting long silver shadows across the lakes and spires of a kingdom shaped more by dreams than by laws. In those mountains wrapped in mist and myth, in pine and silence, there once lived a king not entirely of this world. He was born Ludwig, but to the people he became something else entirely, a phantom king, a monarch carved from porcelain, and light he ruled as if his crown had been spun not from gold, but from sorrow and storybooks. He came to power too young, thrust onto a throne he neither wanted nor trusted. His father, strict and icy, had raised him in cold halls filled with portraits and silence. His mother devout and distant offered only scripture. And so Ludwig turned not to the people or the church, but inward, into the folds of his imagination, into the velvet darkness of his own mind. He became obsessed with beauty, untouchable, unreachable beauty. Not the beauty of politics or power, but the kind that dances in candlelit operas and crumbles in Gothic ruins. He read medieval romances with trembling hands. He spoke of kings who died for roses. He dreamed of swan nights and cursed Grail. He devoured Wagner's operas and called the composer his soul's twin. At night, he wandered alone through forests wrapped in fog, whispering to the trees as if they answered. Then he began to build, not in stone alone, but in longing. One castle rose like a hymn, its towers piercing the clouds. Neuschwanstein, the Swanstone fortress, perched upon cliffs like a fevered memory. It was a place no army could defend, no court could inhabit. Staircases led to nowhere. Rooms glowed with frescoes of dying saints and betrayed lovers. Chandeliers flickered with illusions of eternal dusk, and when the people asked why, Ludwig only said, "It is not for them. It is for the soul." He built more castles that mirrored the palaces of Versailles, ballrooms that never held dancers, dining rooms with hidden pulleys to avoid human contact. He spoke less and less to ministers, more and more to his own reflection. He dined alone, with imaginary guests. He sent swans as messengers, His footsteps echoed endlessly through moonlit halls, where mirrors lined every corner and velvet curtains muffled reality. In time, the whispers began. They said the king was mad, that he feared sunlight and trusted ghosts, that he believed himself touched by divine madness. Ministers grew uneasy, coffers emptied into stone. Bavaria needed leadership. Ludwig offered lullabies, so they came for him. In the summer of 1886, a secret council convened nobles, doctors, politicians. They did not summon the king, nor offer him defense. They simply declared it. Ludwig is insane. He was seized at night, dragged from his sanctuary by torchlight and betrayal. Horses waited in silence. The doctors bowed stiffly. One of them, Dr. Guden, claimed the king was beyond repair. No examination, no hearing, just a signature and a verdict. They took him to Castleberg, a smaller prison masquerading as refuge. Nestled beside Lake Starnberger, body of water black as mourning cloth. 2 days later, Ludwig asked for a walk. Evening had fallen, the sky bruised, purple and silver. The king walked into the mist with Dr. Guden at his side. They passed through the iron gates, under ancient trees whose branches curled like fingers. The lake was still, the air cold and hollow. They did not return. When the search began, no one expected silence. But that was all the forest offered. Not a shout, not a cry, not even the rustle of disturbed leaves. Only at dusk did a servant find them 2 bodies in the shallows of the lake. The water barely licked their boots. Ludwig's eyes were open, staring into a sky that no longer answered him. Beside him, Guden lay lifeless, his face marked by bruises and panic. The lake, they said, had taken them both, but the water held no truth. No water in the king's lungs. No sign of drowning, no struggle, save for the doctor's torn coat and shattered glasses. No one had seen them go. No one had heard them fall. A silent death in a shallow lake under a silent moon. The reports were vague. The witnesses vanished. The guards evasive. And the truth, if ever it existed, was buried beneath titles and shame. Some say Ludwig killed the doctor and then himself. Others claim assassins ended them both to silence the king's madness or his lucidity. Some believe Ludwig fled, that a body double was found, and the real king escaped into exile, to die alone and forgotten. But no one knows. The funeral was quiet. Bavaria mourned a man it never truly understood. Neuschwanstein stood unfinished, its corridors echoing with wind and ghosts. The candles in his throne room burned low, and the mirrors were draped in black dot today. The castles still stand. Tourists wander through their dreams, snapping photos where Ludwig once wept over imaginary banquets. They marvel at the ceilings, painted with swans and angels, at the trapdoors, at the throne room built for no throne. They call him the fairy tale king, as if he were merely a bedtime story gone awry. But sometimes, when dusk thickens and the lake turns glassy and mute, the wind carries a different tale. Locals speak of a figure walking the shore in royal blue, his boots untouched by mud, his face turned toward distant music. A king, they say, who loved beauty more than power, who built sanctuaries of sorrow and palaces for dreams, who died in silence, and who, even now, may be wandering the halls of his forgotten kingdom, looking not for his crown, but for someone who finally, truly understands what he meant to say. And the lake still, quiet, cold, keeps its secret beneath the surface. There are nights when the sea remembers, when the wind howls, not in fury, but in grief, when waves do not crash, but weep. On such nights, under a bruised sky and a grieving moon, the Atlantic murmurs secrets not meant for human ears, secrets of a raft adrift, of madness in salt water, of a ship called Medusa that should never have sailed. It was 1816, and France, aching from the wounds of empire and revolution, tried once more to reach across the world. The Medusa, a royal frigate, was tasked with carrying officials, soldiers, and settlers to Senegal. It flew the Bourbon flag, proud and newly restored. But beneath its polished decks and crisp uniforms was wrought-not of wood, but of arrogance. Captain Hugues de Roy de Chaumaris had not commanded a vessel in over 2 decades. He was appointed not for skill, but for loyalty to the king. He navigated, not by maps, but by vanity. When other ships cautioned against shallow waters off the coast of Africa, he dismissed them with a wave of the hand and a smile of ignorance. And so the Medusa struck, off the bank d'Arguin, in waters that danced. Deceptively shallow and golden, the ship groaned as her belly met sand. Timber splintered, sails flailed, officers panicked. The tide mocked them, inching back like a withheld breath. In the chaos that followed, the truth of man unraveled. There were not enough lifeboats. Plans were made, but not for all. A raft, hastily built of masts and planks, lashed together by desperation and rope, was meant to be towed by the boats. It stretched 65 feet wide, wide enough for over 100 souls who had nowhere else to go. Soldiers, crewmen, and passengers young and old, noble and forgotten, climbed aboard, eyes wide, not with hope, but with silence. They were promised rescue. They were told the boats would guide them to shore, but ropes can break, or be cut. Some say it was the storm. Others say it was the weight. Still others whisper that the boats, carrying the important and the well-dressed, deliberately loosed the raft to its fate, like an offering to the sea dot, and so it drifted, 13 days beneath an indifferent sun and an uncaring moon. The raft swelled with cries, then shrank with silence. Wine was the first to vanish, water next, then the bread. Hunger crept like a shadow into every bone. Some leapt into the sea, believing it led to paradise. Others were pushed. Fights broke out. Knives glinted in moonlight. Blood soaked into wood, and then came the cannibalism. At first it was whispered, a decision made in corners of the mind no man ever wants to visit. But soon it became ritual. The dead were stripped, not for burial, but for sustenance. Flesh dried in the sun like salted pork. Organs were divided by rank. Some refused, they died. Others feasted, weeping. The sea watched, saying nothing. By the 4th day, over half were gone. By the 8th, madness reigned. Eyes turned glassy, voices lost language. One man, delusional, attempted to conduct an orchestra with a bone. Another rocked back and forth, whispering nursery rhymes in bloodied sand. Storms came, peeling men from the raft like petals. One wave took 6 souls in a single gasp. The sea gave no answers, only salt and hunger. On the 13th day, salvation arrived, not divine, but in the form of sails on the horizon. A rescue ship, Argus, spotted the survivors clinging like barnacles to the raft's ruin. 15 remained, 15 from 140-7. The others had been claimed by the ocean, by madness, or by the gnawing teeth of hunger. They were brought ashore, skeletal and silent. Their eyes, those who could still see, seemed to hold the echo of waves that no longer existed. France listened to their story and recoiled. It was too brutal, too raw. The government tried to bury the tale, to paint it as a necessary tragedy, a footnote of unfortunate events. But truth, when soaked in blood and brine, will not stay buried. One man, a young artist named Tudor Jerichar, heard the survivors speak. He listened not just to their words, but to the spaces between them, the pauses, the tremors. He did not flinch. He painted. For a year he obsessed. He studied corpses. He sketched twisted limbs. He interviewed the survivors again and again. He slept in morgues, and when he could endure it no more, he began a canvas the size of grief, the raft of the Medusa. It does not scream, it whispers. A raft adrift in emptiness. A wave rises in the distance, hope or doom. A man signals, his arm raised like a broken mast. Around him, the dying cling to the dead, and the dead offer no complaint. It is not a painting of death. It is a painting of what remains when death becomes familiar. Today, it hangs in the Louvre, but it does not rest. Visitors feel the salt. They smell the rot. Some swear the canvas shifts when no one looks, that the eyes of the lost follow you as you pass, that if you linger too long, you hear waves behind the silence. And the ocean still remembers. It remembers the arrogance that led to ruin, the rope cut or broken, the raft drifting, the silence after the storm. It remembers the taste of desperation, of flesh, of prayers unanswered. It remembers the Medusa not as a ship, but as a wound. And when the wind rises just right, and the moon tilts in morning, some sailors swear they see a shape in the distance. A flat, splintered shape riding the waves, carrying men without eyes, without skin, with mouths open not to scream, but to sing, a song without words, a hymn of hunger. There are cities, the world forgets, and cities that forget themselves. But some, like Breda, remember in silence. They remember not through song or monument, but through the taste of ash in bread, the echo of gnawed bones in the wind, and the way shadows linger too long in the corners of cellars long abandoned. In the year 1624, the city of Breda stood proud behind its thick stone walls, ringed by moats and sharpened will. But pride does not feed the stomach, and stone cannot stop time. When the Spanish came under the red banner of Ambrogio Spinola, they did not come with fire or fury. They came with patience. They came to wait. Encamped across the Dutch countryside, the Spanish army tightened its grip like a slowly coiling serpent. The siege was not thunder and cannon, but strangulation. No supplies, no escape, no mercy. The first few weeks passed in resolve. The city's defenders, Dutch and English alike, walked the ramparts with hard eyes and measured breath. They rationed, carefully, whispered hope to their children, and lit candles in the church for a God that felt increasingly distant. But as winter settled its iron cloak over the land, food began to vanish. The cellars emptied. The market squares became ghostly stages, their stalls abandoned, their awnings torn by wind. Snow fell, covering the city in silence. Then came the hunger. It arrived quietly, like a pale guest slipping through a back door. The bread grew thinner, soup turned to water. Flour was dusted with sawdust. Some boiled leather, hoping the memory of fat still clung to it. Others chewed belts, boots, books. Then the rats came, not in infestation, but invitation. Traps lined the alleyways. Children crept through gutters with sticks and sacks, rewarded for each twitching tail they brought home. In kitchens that once smelled of herbs and butter, now simmered rat stew-grey meat, stringy and bitter. Cats vanished from windowsills, then dogs from the yards. The city feasted, not in joy, but in desperation. And still, the Spanish waited. Time stretched like a rack. People grew leaner, hollower. Mothers offered the last crumbs to their infants, then died quietly in corners. Fathers wept openly when they could no longer protect, no longer provide. Priests whispered funeral rites over piles of cloth instead of coffins, in the darkness beneath the city. Those deep brick cellars, carved centuries ago, something else began. It started with whispers, strange gatherings at night, doors that creaked, open only for those with hollow eyes. The church bells stopped ringing. Candles were lit in strange formations. Crosses were turned upside down, not out of blasphemy, but bargaining. Something had to give. Some say it began when the baker's daughter vanished. She'd gone to fetch water from the well near the town square. Her pail returned, rolling in the frost. Her footprints stopped, suddenly no struggle, no scream, just absence. Then the blacksmith's son. Then the old woman who fed pigeons even when she had nothing for herself. They called it sacrifice, not loudly, not in the squares, but in the hush of hallways, in the glances between neighbors, in the blood that began to reappear on snow that should have been clean. The city, starving, had begun to feed itself. There were those who resisted, who barred their doors and held lanterns through the night. But shadows do not knock. They seep in through cracks, under thresholds, behind the eyes. A soldier, half mad with hunger, claimed he saw a procession move through the streets one night. Cloaked figures, faces covered with sackcloth, bearing torches made of twisted rags, soaked in grease. At their center was a cart, and on it something someone bound and still breathing. The man hanged himself. The next morning with his own belt. The rats grew fat even as the people thinned. Some believed they were being fed, drawn to certain alleys where blood was spilled with purpose. One woman was caught painting symbols beneath the church eaves with her own blood. She claimed she was keeping the city alive. She said the rats told her so. No one argued. She was left to her work, and still the Spanish waited. They watched through their spyglasses as smoke curled up from the chimneys less and less each day. They smelled no cooking fires. They saw no movement on the ramparts, but they heard something. They heard a song, soft, dissonant, rising in the night like a lullaby sung through cracked teeth. It came from within the walls, a dirge of children's voices and low, humming men, layered with grief and something else, something giddy. The Spanish did not fire. They did not need to. Breda was already hollow, and then, in June, when the sun returned and the trees blossomed beyond the ruined fields, the gates opened. Out came the survivors, tattered grey, no longer citizens, but phantoms. They did not fight. They did not beg. They simply surrendered. Spinola took the city with barely a whisper. No glory, no fanfare. He walked through streets littered with bones too small to be pigs, past homes marked with sigils and black stains. He saw walls scratched with prayers and warnings. Do not open the cellar, the rats remember, it lives below. He ordered bread to be brought in by the cartload, meat, wine, water, but no one touched it. The citizens sat in their doorways, watching the sun with blank eyes. Children flinched at the sound of laughter. Dogs refused to enter certain alleys. The feast was over, but the hunger remained. Spinola left Breda months later, victorious in paper and record. But his men whispered of nightmares, of rats that followed them beyond the walls, of voices that called out at night in the language of bone and shadow. Breda was never the same. Even now, centuries later, in the hush of winter, when the wind passes through its ancient streets, there is a sound beneath the silence's scratching, a skittering. Some say it's just the rats, but the old families know better. They say the hunger lives on, that it does not die, only sleeps, and that sometimes, in the darkest cellars, the feast begins again. There are flames that burn only once, and flames that never go out. Some fires are loud, devouring wood and flesh with screams and smoke. Others, quieter, burn beneath the skin, beneath the earth, beneath memory. In the still dark hours of Christmas. Morning, 1945. A fire bloomed in Fayetteville, West Virginia. It crackled to life, not with cheer, but with hunger. The solder house white clapboard, warm with laughter, pine garlands, and the sugar-dusted scent of holiday sweets was its feast. And when the fire was done, it left behind more than ashes. It left behind silence. It was 1 a.m. when Jenny Sarda awoke to the sound of something falling sharp, like a rock through glass, then silence again. She waited. No wind, no footsteps, just the creaking hush of a winter night. But unease has a voice, and it whispered her down the stairs. She checked the living room, where the light still burned and the curtains hung open. The front door stood ajar. Strange, she thought, but not alarming. Not yet. Her children had stayed up late. There were gifts, candies, whispers, the soft rustling of wrapping paper. They were supposed to sleep in the attic that night, 5 of them: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. She hadn't gone up to check at 1:30 a.m. Flames were licking the stairwell. George, soderer, strong, steady man with hands like shovels, rushed into the smoke. He called their names again and again. He tried the stairs, but the fire spat him back. He tried the ladder, but it was gone. He tried his trucks to drive them up to the windows, but the engines would not start, though they'd run just yesterday. The water barrel outside was frozen solid, and the fire brigade, delayed by chaos and Christmas, would not arrive until morning. The house fell in on itself before the hour turned in the snow outside. 5 children stood barefoot. 5 were missing. What should have been found in the ash was no bones, no bodies, no teeth, no blood, just blackened beams, scorched earth, and an aching question that would echo for decades. Where did they go? The firemen said the blaze had consumed them entirely. But flesh does not vanish like breath. Bones remain. Even in the fiercest heat, something stays behind. But the cellar yielded nothing. Not a sliver, not a tooth. The sodders refused to believe. And from that refusal, the legend began. A telephone repairman discovered that the wires to the house had been cut, not burned. A neighbor reported seeing a man stealing something from the property the night before. Another claimed to have seen children peering out of a car as it sped away during the fire, their faces lit by flames behind them. In the weeks that followed, the sightings began. A woman said she'd seen the missing children watching from the back of a window, silent, pale, afraid. A hotel owner claimed a guest had checked in with 5 children who matched their description. A stranger said they'd overheard a conversation in a barman bragging that they knew what had happened that night. And then, the photograph that had arrived by mail 20 years later. A thick envelope addressed to Jenny. No return address. Inside, a single black and white photo. A young man, his dark eyes wide and searching. His hair curled just so. His chin tilted in the same proud way George had once tilted his. On the back, scrawled in a trembling hand, Louis Soda. I love brother Frankie. LL Boys, a 90132 or 35. No explanation, no sender, no peace. Jenny pinned the photo to her wall. She kept it beside the family portraits, beside the charred watch that stopped ticking at 1:35 a.m., beside the ladder that had been found hidden in a ditch. She dressed in black every day after the fire. She planted a garden where the house once stood, and she never stopped tending it. For decades, it bloomed like a wound. George built a billboard on the side of the highway. Big white letters, black and white faces. What happened to our children? It asked. Below, a reward. Above, 5 eyes that never seemed to blink. People slowed their cars to stare. Theories blossomed like weeds in a graveyard. The Sodders had enemies. George had spoken loudly against Mussolini. Had the mafia taken the children? Had they been kidnapped, sold, hidden, saved, or was it something stranger? Some said the children had never died because they had never burned, that something in the fire had reached in not to kill, but to take, that the house had been built atop old ground, a fault line of sorrow, that on certain nights you could still hear footsteps in the ash, voices calling out through the smoke. Others believed time itself had buckled, that the moments split like glass, and 5 children stepped sideways into a place where the snow still fell, the garlands still hung, and the fire never came. None of it could be proven. All of it mattered, because what remained was not just absence, but presence. The house gone, but the beds still made in memory. The shoes still lined up. In imagination, the stockings never taken down every Christmas. Jenny hung them again, not out of tradition, but defiance. She believed, until the day she died, that her children were out there, lost, hidden, waiting. The others believed too, though time wore, their faith thinner with each passing year. George died with that photo still in his wallet. Their surviving children grew older, but never stopped tracing shadows. The billboard remained weather-worn and quiet. It stood not as accusation, but as vigil, and the town moved on, as towns do. But the scar beneath the surface never healed. Even now, some nights, when the snow falls just right and the lights flicker near Fayetteville, people say they see 5 children walking along the edge of the road barefoot, hand in hand, never speaking, looking for a house that burned long ago. And in certain homes, if you leave out a stocking or a small shoe or a glass of milk beside the fire, they say it will be gone by morning, not stolen, taken gently, as if someone came home for just a moment, as if they still remember, as if they are still waiting to be found. The wind came first dry, rising from the east like a breath from a broken mouth. It swept over the red-tiled roofs of Smyrna and stirred the minarets like morning fingers. In that wind was a taste of salt, smoke, and old betrayal. And then came the fire bright, unmerciful and hungry. Smyrna had always been a city of many names, many tongues. She spoke Greek in the cafes, Armenian in the bakeries, Turkish in the bazaars, French in the parlors. Her breath was a hymn to coexistence, her walls papered with centuries. But empires do not dream in harmony. They end in fire, and Smyrna was made of wood. In September of 1922, The air itself felt thin with expectation. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed like wet parchment, and from its torn remains rose the Turkish nationalists, led by Mustafa Kemal. The Greeks had occupied western Anatolia for years, but now they were in retreat, dragged back to the sea by history's tide, and Smyrna cosmopolitan, coveted, vulnerable, was the final prize. On the 9th of September, Turkish troops entered the city. The people had heard rumors, what the soldiers had done to Armenian towns, how churches became slaughterhouses, how silence followed them like a dog. But Smyrna, ancient and proud, had survived Romans, Byzantines, Crusaders. She believed herself protected. She was not, no one agrees on who lit the first flame. Some say it sparked from an Armenian house, others say it leaped from Turkish torches soaked in kerosene. Eyewitnesses claimed to see soldiers carrying jugs of oil. Women in headscarves whispered of matches struck with trembling hands. One thing is certain, on the 13th of September, the wind shifted and Smyrna ignited. It began in the Armenian quarter. Within hours, the flames moved like a tide. Wooden homes caught like dry leaves. Curtains burst into fire. Children ran into the streets and vanished beneath falling beams. Bells tolled in churches, not for prayer, but for warning. Smoke rolled in black waves across the roofs, and then came the screams. Thousands surged to the quay. Greeks, Armenians, Levantines merchants, widows, schoolteachers, seamstressized toward the sea. Behind them, their homes crackled and collapsed. Before them, the cold waters shimmered with reflections of flame. The harbor filled with bodies, not boats. American, British, and French warships floated in the bay like silent witnesses, their decks still and their flags unsullied. A Greek priest held a crucifix aloft and shouted until his throat gave out. An Armenian mother, eyes hollow with ash, waded into the sea with a baby held high. One sailor aboard an American ship said he heard music, the hymn of the burning woven from sobs and collapsing timber. Yet the ships did not come. Orders were not to intervene. In a single day, the old quarters were devoured. The sky turned amber and crimson, and night never came, only smoke. Cats leaped from rooftops, their fur aflame. Horses bucked blindly into the water. Entire churches burned from the inside out. Stone altars crumbled under red-hot beams. The city's bones were blackening. The fire burned for 9 days. It moved like a sentient thing, wrapping itself around the soul of Smyrna and squeezing. Bodies lined the harbor like driftwood. In the chaos, there were whispers of mass killings behind closed doors, of Turkish soldiers with knives, of young girls taken into darkness and never returned. Some say the priests were sewn into their robes and burned alive. Some say the children hid in wine cellars and died whispering lullabies. The harbor became a graveyard. Every night, more people disappeared into the sea. Some jumped. Some were pushed. Some simply walked in, as if the water could cleanse what the fire could not. When the flames finally died, silence took their place. No celebration, no declaration, just smoke, ash, and a sun that rose over ruin. The American ships, finally moved by the stench and the wailing, began to rescue a few. But it was too late. The heart of Smyrna had already stopped beating. When historians speak of Smyrna now, they do so with qualifiers and caution. Who lit the match? Who gave the order? Was it revenge, or strategy, or madness? The Turks deny arson. The Greeks accuse them. The Armenians remember only the scent of their own dead. The world, too distant and too careful, never settled the question. The fire was no one's fault and everyone's sin. In old paintings, Smyrna is golden. Her bay sparkles, her markets hum, her domes glitter in the sun. But no painting captures the smell of burning silk, the sound of a girl calling for her father until the fire chokes her name. No artist has painted the moment when a woman, clutching her rosary, waded waist-deep into the harbor, kissed her baby's forehead, and let the sea take him. The soul of the city was scattered, some to Athens, some to Beirut, some to dust. The cosmopolitan dream of Smyrna did not burn. It was erased, atom by atom, until nothing remained but grey walls and silence. And so the city sleeps, no, not with the peace of the saved, but with the silence of the ruined. Stones do not speak of what they saw. The sea does not return, the children and the ghosts, those thousands left unwept and unburied, whisper only to the wind that first brought the fire. What remains of Smyrna is not stone, nor ash, but a wound. One no nation will claim, and none can forget. The lake does not move. It waits in the far northern silence, where the sun hangs low and the wind carries no scent but ice. There is a place shaped like a whisper, Anjakuni, a lake cradled in stone, and stillness. No roads lead to it. Only those who listen long enough hear its name, spoken softly through the birch trees, through the hoarse moan of winter wind dragging itself across snow. The kind of place the world forgets until it takes something. They say it was November of 1930 that a trapper named Joe LaBelle, hardened by cold and silence, arrived at the lake's edge expecting firelight and fish, stories told in a new beside seal-fat lamps. He had passed this way before. He knew the people. He had traded with them, smoked meat, tanned skins, smiles shared over simple warmth. But when he stepped into the village this time, the only thing that greeted him was the wind. There were no cries of children, no laughter rising from the huts. No dogs barked, no smoke curled into the brittle air. And yet the fires were still smoldering. Food had been laid out, half-eaten needles left in skins, a pot of broth still warm. The sled dogs, still in their harnesses, had starved to death, where they stood frozen like statues, eyes glazed with hunger and frost. The snow was clean, no footprints led away, not a single track to mark where dozens of people had gone, as if they had evaporated, as if they had been swallowed mid-breath. Joe searched the camp. Every tent was untouched, blankets arranged, rifles leaning on frames, beads and charms left behind. Not looted, not abandoned in fear. Something else, something deeper. He found the graves at the edge of the settlement. They had been dug out by something with care. No bones, no offerings, only hollows where the dead had once lain, and the unsettling certainty that they, too, had gone. The trapper fled through the snow, back to civilization. He told his story with eyes wide and unblinking. The mounted police were summoned. A report was filed. Men came with guns and questions, but no answers. The village was real. The emptiness was real. And then the silence returned, thicker than before. Skeptics would later claim it was a Taylor frostbitten hallucination or myth bloated in the retelling. They said no such village ever stood there, that Joe had mistaken an old hunting camp for something more, that snow plays tricks on the eyes and wind on the mind. But others whispered differently. The Inuit elders would not speak of Anjakuni, not directly. They spoke instead of places the land reclaims, of watchers in the stars, of the Kalupali, women with webbed fingers who sing under the ice and lure the unwary, of the shapes that come in the night when the aurora dances and the spirits walk. The sky, they say, has mouths. One old woman, her face lined like a parker's leather, whispered to a missionary that the village had broken the old law. They had carved a word they were not meant to know into a drum, a name that had no translation, only sound. They had sung it during the long night, when time slows and dreams bleed, and something answered, something from the places older than snow. Others believed it was the lights, the northern ones, that during one long burning shimmer, the aurora had bent too low, touched the earth like a veil falling from a dancer's hand, that the lights had a weight, a will, that they wrapped the village in their green fire and lifted it into the sky. No scream, no fight, just silence. Some say it was a curse, that long ago the ancestors of Anjikuni made a bargain with the lake, that they would feed it stories, songs, children's laughter, and in return the lake would keep them hidden from the world's grief. But when the stories stopped, when their mouths grew quiet, the lake remembered. It took what was owed. Even now, the lake remains unchanged, cold, still, watching campers who pass nearby speak of strange things, of firelight seen on its far shore that vanishes when approached, of sudden fog that rises without warmth, of voices that do not echo but circle. One man claimed he heard a lullaby in the dead of night, drifting across the ice. Another found small handprints pressed into his frozen tent inside and out. No one lives there now, no Inuit, no travelers, no homes. Just the hollowed earth where once the fire pits lay, and a ring of stones that form no circle anyone can name. They say when you stand at the water's edge, if you wait long enough, you will hear the village, not in sound but in absence, the hush of a mother who does not know where her child has gone, the breath held between a question and an answer, the stillness after a name is called and no one replies. The lake is not evil, it does not hate, it simply remembers. Some disappearances leave a trail of blood, a scream, a broken doorframe, but the vanishings at Anjikuni left something colder, a question without shape, an absence without reason, a memory half dreamed and half swallowed. And so, in the heart of the Canadian North, there is a place where time folded, where voices once laughed and were stilled, where something vast and wordless passed through and took quietly, completely, without echo. The snow covers everything now, but beneath it, the land still listens.